Okay, well, thank you very much for having me here. I really appreciate it. And thank you for those of you who mentioned me in terms of my various projects. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. I just yesterday finished a draft of the main section of a book called Island Fishing, which is like my island farming, except it's about fishing. And I'm very excited about that. So that's the good news. The bad news is something I'll follow up with what Kathy was commenting on, and that is about saving your work. A lot of the basis of this were family trees that I developed on MyHeritage. And I just discovered 2 days ago that that had been wiped. So there's a lot of, I've gone, asked them if they can restore it somehow. I certainly didn't do it, but that's definitely going to be tragic if that actually happened. So anyway, please save your work. I've got a lot of paper files and I've got a lot of backup things, but that actual online stuff is maybe gone. So anyway, I'm going to talk about the Mitchell Bay Band. And as Joe mentioned, Joe Dolan mentioned, I did this in conjunction with the San Juan Island National Historic Park under contract with them. A lot of the research was mainly through the focus of what's called the Roblin Report, and I'll go into details about that. But I'd like to begin with this statement that a lot of people have adopted lately. Let us acknowledge that we reside on the ancestral lands and waters of the Coast Salish people, who have called this place home since time immemorial. And let us honor inherent Aboriginal and treaty rights that have been passed down from generation to generation. I think that's a good prologue to any history in the islands, but it's particularly relevant to what I'm going to be talking about, and you'll see that in a sec. But I do want to start out with other thanks, and first of all to you guys for letting me on here and the Orcas Island Library for supporting this thing. I particularly want to thank Joe for his support of the project, both financial, emotional, and historical research-wise. There are a number of people who really helped, including several of you who are present. Robin, Lynn, and you're just invaluable colleagues in terms of help this way. Lisa Nash Lawrence, who is Mitchell Bay and Swinomish in Heritage and has been a wonderful help. Doug McCutcheon knows a lot about local history and has been commenting on this project. And then I want to end with Candace Wellman, who, if you haven't read her books, I really highly recommend them. She's written a lot about Indigenous Euro-American marriages in the region and families, and those, she's just, for me, has really revolutionized the study of this subject and is just a groundbreaker that way. So thank you, Candace. So I'm going to tell you a little about myself as prologue. I don't know how well you can read this, but this is my birth certificate. And I was born in the same hospital as Barack Obama, a little bit earlier than him. And this is not from Kenya, I will tell you. This is from the territory of Hawaii. And I was born in Kapiolani Hospital in 1953. And both my parents came several generations back from living in Hawaii. And in the early 60s, they bought a place here on San Juan Island where my wife Lovell and our family lives. And And so we came here summers, and one time we were on the ferry, and my mother overheard a woman saying to her daughter, please pass me the pa'a bag. Now, we all used to fly Pan American Airways, and but in Hawaii, when you saw the PAA, you pronounced the pa'a. So it was an automatic tip that this person was connected with Hawaii somehow. And so my mother went ahead and just asked her, I noticed you said this, are you Hawaiian? And she said, yes, I am. And our family used to live in the San Juan Islands and then moved to Salt Spring and live there now. So this was just a fascinating connection, and it really started to intrigue both my mother, who went on to do a lot of research about it, and myself in regard to the actual Kanakas, the Hawaiian Islanders who were living here in the islands and married Indigenous women, including Mitchell Bay women. And so I will get back to this later, but that was really kind of what sparked my interest way back when. So the main focus of this study itself was the Roebelin report. The Roebelin report was really a lens by which I started looking at the Mitchell Bay Band, as this group of local Indians was called. And so the question comes, well, why the Roebelin report? I mean, why did Roebelin actually do this report? And I am indebted a lot to Lynn Weber Rochefort, who did the background research on this. And if you really want to know more about it, I recommend you go to the History Link and look up her article on the Mitchell Bay Band. But it stemmed from 1887 when Congress passed the General Allotment Act, and it was both a good and bad thing, but the kind of bad part of it was that Indians, designated Indians, could sell and receive individual properties. And at the time it was passed, only members of officially recognized tribes could do this. And so back in 1904, they surveyed the Quinault Reservation on the Olympic Peninsula, and it was a huge reservation. And there are a lot of interests wanting to get at that land, Euro-American interests mainly, and particularly the foresting areas for that. So in 1911, the Secretary of the Interior designated that allotments could be made to Quinault tribal members, but also those affiliated with that tribe. And so this was an option of various non-recognized tribal members to be able to enroll as Quinault Indians in order to get this land. This was revoked in 1912, so a man named Thomas G. Bishop decided to organize various both tribal members and non-recognized Native Americans, and organize them into a group to kind of lobby for land under this General Allotment Act. And so he brought these people together in 1914 in Tacoma and established the Northwest Federation of American Indians. And then he proceeded to go throughout the state of Washington, trying to sign up non-recognized tribal members for applying for lands this way. And he came in particular to the San Juan Islands, and what he came with were, first of all, affidavits of these people's tribal affiliations, and then applications for adoption to the Quinault tribe. And in the affidavit itself, which he formed as a kind of standard form after a year or so, the applicant would put down what their Indian blood was, how they got it, what their tribal affiliation was in their ancestry, and then talk about their family. So who else was eligible? If it was a mother, for instance, were her children eligible, or were siblings eligible, and things like that. These forms were witnessed at least by 3 people, or they were witnessed and notarized by Bishop himself, or his representative that he sent to various groups. And these documents in themselves are just a rich source of information. So Bishop gathered all of these. He had over 1,000 affidavits, and he went to Washington to talk to the Secretary of the Interior about it. And the Secretary of the Interior basically decided that it needed further research. This is an example of an affidavit by Ben Briggs, who was Mitchell Bay Band. In it, you can see at the top thing that he swears that he is of half Indian blood. He then talks about his siblings, so Hattie and Mary Briggs and so on and so forth. He gives 2 witnesses here, Joseph Sandwith of Friday Harbor and Charles French of Roach Harbor, but Charles French was actually in the Mitchell Bay area. And then he certifies that, that he is actually of Indian blood and so on and so forth. And there's a little note, a very small note at the bottom, Agnes Smith, the Cowlitz descendant of Mary Contanen, is full blood Cowlitz, and see Cowlitz records. So this was Thomas, I think this was probably Roblin's comment about trying to link these families here. So this is one of the documents you will find in the Roblin report itself and filed under the family name. So this is under Briggs, and will often be Bishop's actual claimant affidavit. So as I said, after Bishop went to Washington, the Secretary of the Interior decided to look into this more. And so he got Charles Ernest Roblin to investigate it further. Roblin worked for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and this is his, I found this on Ancestry. This is his obituary on the left-hand side. That's his gravestone on the top. And he died in 1953, which I will remind you, that's when I was born in the territory of Hawaii. So there is kind of linkage here, if you will. But he proceeded to really do a deep dive into the research on these unenrolled Indians. And he went and interviewed each member of a person who had done an affidavit. He got their full family history, or as much of it as he could. And he did this from 1916 to 1919, and he submitted it on January 31st, 1919, which, by the way, is just a little bit more than 102 years ago. So in this report, he talked about the various tribes. So he took these affidavits and he filed the families with different tribes. And if they are recognized tribes like the Klallam or the Lummi or other groups like that, he would file it under that. But he also, there was this unrecognized tribal group called the Mitchell Bay Band, or the Mitchell Tribe of Indians. And I find this really key to the understanding of this whole group is what he said in his report. On the islands of San Juan County, Washington, there are a number of mixed blood Indians and a few full bloods who claim membership in the Mitchell Tribe of Indians. Mitchell Bay is a harbor on San Juan Island, the largest of the group. These Indians are inextricable with the Indians of British Columbia, Vancouver Island, and from Alaska. The bands and tribes of the inland waters of the coast have mingled for centuries. but those who are still on the Washington side of the international boundary should be classed as one band. They call themselves the Mitchell Bay Indians, and I have scheduled them as such. So I want to point out three things here. One is that Roebelin is clearly recognizing that these people self-regarded themselves as Mitchell Bay Indians. And so if they called themselves Clallam, he would file them under Clallam. If they called themselves Lummi, he would file them under Lummi. But if they called themselves Mitchell Bay Band, then he would file it under Mitchell Bay. And so the second thing I want to recognize is that he clearly recognized that this was a group that had intermarried quite a bit. And I think this is probably true of most of the Coast Salish tribes in the area, but this is one group or tribe that it was really emphasized. And so the whole idea of being a full-blooded Mitchell Bay tribe was really kind of a misnomer in a certain sense, and that brings me to the third point, and that is that the US government, in dealing with Indians in the area, really preferred dealing with tribes, and tribes were recognized Indian groups that in fact signed treaties, like the treaties of Point Elliott, where they were given certain rights and they were given certain designated land reservations reserved for them. This was not one of those recognized land and groups, and so it was not treated as such. But Roebelin was very serious about this and pursued it in that manner. So you can find, let me just pause here a second, say you can find this on Ancestry.com. If you look up the Roebelin report, there will be two distinct files. One is the actual roll of tribes, including the Mitchell Bay tribe, and the other one is the actual reports on the families themselves, what are called the rolls, R-O-L-L-S. And so you can look it up by family, and in that you will find Bishop's original affidavit forms, which I showed you earlier, and then you will find Roebelin's meticulous notes. So this one has to do with Alice C. Lightheart. She was the daughter of Samuel Harrison Gross. It gives her father, it gives her mother, who was full-blood Mitchell Bay. It gives when they married, where they lived, who their children were, so who are the siblings of Alice Lightheart, how they married, who their children were, and it's just a wealth of information in terms of genealogy, and it's just really kind of the key to a lot of these things. In going through one of these family files, I ran across somebody's homework. I love this. And so it's apparently Theo, I think. I don't know if Roebelin had a son named Theo, but these are, arithmetic and spelling. And I was a bad speller to begin with too, and I really empathize with the 76% here. Okay, so who constituted the Mitchell Bay tribe according to Charles Roebelin? There were 12 families. They're listed here in cap letters and bolded. And then on the right-hand side is the actual Mitchell Bay woman who formed the affiliation for the Mitchell Bay tribe. You'll notice that all of these are Euro-American names, and that's how Roebelin actually filed it. So this is the convention of the time, and still continues to be a lot of the convention of our time, and as you file it by the husband's last name, which is generally Euro-American, right? And I will talk about that later. That's a big issue in regard to genealogical studies in terms of this group. The 12th is an interesting case. Roebland had it filed as Stone. This was based on the handwriting of one of Bishop's affidavit forms. He doesn't have anything in the file except for that one form. I realized that it was a misspelling, and in fact it was Stove, and it refers to Harriet Hattie Briggs, who married a John Stove and settled on Waldron for a while and then Orcas. And so that gets a connection back to the Briggs family up here. So that's, in essence, there were basically 11 families. And here's the actual schedule. So when you go to the Roebland roll, you will see, as I said, two separate files. One is the actual individual families themselves, and the other one are the actual roll itself. And so we see here at the beginning, here are the Barlows, here are the Briggs, and there's the Grays, and it gives all of the siblings, the children, and the grandchildren, and so forth. So it goes down to the Cayuse, the Chevaliers, Crawfords, down to the Clarks and Browns, and again to the Grays, Grosses, Laportes, Lawsons, Oaks, and finally this John Stone over here. So, which again goes back to the Briggs. So those are the actual groups that you will find. These are basically the indices to the family files that you will find in the genealogical thing. There was a related group that was really interesting that he called the San Juan Island tribe. And he didn't, in his report, he did not give a summary of the San Juan Island tribe the way he did with the Mitchell Bay tribe. But there are just two family files in this. One is McKay, which was associated with Mary Dease, who was the daughter of a Hudson Bay Company, French Canadian, and the Walker clan itself. So these are two additional families, and here's the actual role for that. And again, it's McKay and Walker and Knowlson. I will say it gets a little bit confusing. This is a James McKay. There is a McKay, Charles McKay, associated with Friday Harbor history that Lynn did a whole bunch of research on. In fact, that's what got her into the Mitchell Bay Band, I believe, to begin with. But this James McKay is not related to that McKay. Okay, where were the Mitchell Bay tribe from? This is kind of like asking who's buried in Grant's tomb, right? Well, they were from Mitchell Bay. Well, sort of. There's kind of a long story to that, and I won't go into all of it. But basically, Mitchell Bay, there were four kind of major prehistoric or pre-contact sites for the Coast Salish or Straight Salish on San Juan Island or Henry Island. That is Open Bay on Henry Island, Mitchell Bay, the Garrison Bay area, and then what became known as the Pearl Little Estate, which was associated with Sheet Claymo. These are shared equally in terms of history by the Lummi and the Saanich and somewhat the Songhees. And both the Saanich and the Lummi have origin narratives in regard to Mitchell Bay. So that is their Garden of Eden, if you will. That is where they originated, according to some. And so it's really this kind of northwest part of San Juan Island that becomes this way, except that it is, as Roebland says, it's very mixed up in terms of who actually constituted parts of this tribe. So it was all the way from Songhees, who actually originated in the Victoria area of Vancouver Island, the Saanich on the Saanich Peninsula, who are actually on the Saanich Peninsula, but further north into the what are called the Canadian San Juans, the Semiahmoo, who were near Boundary Bay on the US mainland, Lummi south of that, the Samish south of that near the Anacortes, but also had a territorial area on southeastern Lopez and that area. The Swinomish, again, near their reservation there. The Clallam, all the way down on the Olympic Peninsula, and the Cowlitz all the way down, near the Columbia River in Washington State, and then northern tribes. So we have all these various Native American groups or First Peoples groups coming and forming this Mitchell Bay Band or Mitchell Bay Tribe. And I can't emphasize this more, and that is that it is truly a multi-tribal situation of marriages that way. So this kind of, I'll give you a better map in a sec, but this is a try in the 1850s by one of the members of the US Boundary Commission to assign various tribes to areas in here. And you can see the San Juan Islands kind of here in the middle, and then you can see the Songhees here, Saanich here, Cowichan here, Lummi over here, Samish, going down to the Swinomish down here, Skagit down here, and eventually Clallam down here. And this is Wayne Suttle's version of it in his PhD dissertation on the economic and history of the Strait Salish people in this area. And so again, you can find Clallam to the south. You've got Suk over here, Songish, Saanich, Semiahmoo, Lummi, Samish here, Samish here, Swinomish, and then going down to Skagit. So this is all a group that is surrounding the San Juan Islands. And part of the reason for this, as I understand it, is that at contact, when Euro-Americans first started writing down the history of their encounters with indigenous peoples here in the San Juan Islands, they encountered only a few settlements in the islands that were actually there. And a good lot of them were concentrated on Mitchell Bay, right here in northwest San Juan Island. But most of the Indian villages encountered were in that big circle around the San Juan Islands here. So it's almost like a donut hole in a certain sense. So these became the winter villages of the people who formerly occupied and used the San Juan Islands. So when you break down those various groups, you have the Songish or Songhees, who are again coming from the kind of Victoria region over here, and they're using various reef net and harvest sites along here mainly during the summer season and up in here. You have the Saanich coming from the Saanich Peninsula, but also up on Salt Spring Island and that area, and they're mainly using northern San Juan Island and Henry Island and Stewart Island. And you have the Lummi, who are coming kind of from the northeast area and actually coming to, and I'm sorry, I don't have a map of this, but coming to Orcas and northern San Juan Island and using it. So you have all these groups coming basically seasonally to use the islands. But you also have a few existing settlements here in the islands. I mentioned that, that Roeblin's process was really kind of a self-designated process. So if a person called themselves Clallam, he assigned them to the Clallam tribe. But these are clearly had Mitchell Bay connections. So we find these other family names, Jones and French, being married to women who were who self-identified as Clallam, but were associated with the Mitchell Bay Band. In terms of the Lummi, we have a really famous family, that of Chiclaymalt, or Indian Tom, and he was Lummi and is and had settled, got an actual what's called an Indian settlement at what was later called the Pearl Little estate after his daughter Pearl Little. You have the Snohomish tribe, Nellie George marrying Matthias Paul Rethleson, and they're settling in Beaverton Valley in San Juan Island. Swinomish tribe of the two Thomas daughters or sisters, and they're marrying two Frenchmen and settling on Waldron Island. And then the Cowlitz, which is a really important connection. So this is not obviously Straight Salish group, but the Cowlitz from further down on the mainland in Washington, and particularly the Delaunay family, which had a huge impact on the San Juan Islands in terms of their marriage. And so these are the family names that they fall under: Laplante, Archambault, and Burr-Smith. And then you had the northern tribes. So you had Cowichan, the Chemainus tribe. So we have Teresa Lawrence marrying, I think it's Julian Lawrence on Shaw Island. You have Lucy Morris or Morse from the Howcan tribe near Haida Gwaii up north, and marrying Patrick Began. And then Anna Pike of the Tsimshian tribe, again further north, marrying Christopher Rosler. Now, one element that's pretty interesting this way is that even a number of what were called Mitchell Bay Band or Mitchell Bay tribe under Roeblin's report were in fact originated from northern tribes, but were adopted as members of the tribe. And we'll notice that, if you go way back to Bishop's effort to enroll people and get affidavits for them getting land from the Quinault tribe, one of the first things was to be adopted as members of that Quinault tribe. I don't know much about this, but my understanding is that the tribal sense of adoption is in many ways very different from the Euro-American sense of adoption. So it was not uncommon at all for a northern tribal Indian to be adopted into the Mitchell Bay Band or other tribal groups here locally. And that was just an accepted fact. That was usually, as a child, they were adopted and became full members of the tribe that way. Okay, let's go back to Mitchell Bay and look at some documents that way. This is as soon as the joint occupation was over, and the San Juan Islands became not anymore the disputed islands, but actually American islands. One of the first things that the American government did is came in and they actually surveyed the land in what's called a Township and Range Survey. And that was in 1874. So you probably remember that in 1872 was the boundary dispute settled. In 1874, they went in and surveyed all the islands. This is a survey sheet for the township around Mitchell Bay here. We see Mitchell Bay at the bottom here. And we see several familiar names that we'll see later on. So for instance, Peter Lamy over here. We have Smith Burr up further north in Westcott Bay. We have Jacob Lau, who was an interesting case, who may have been the only African-American or Canadian African-Canadian in these times. And then we have what are called houses over here in Open Bay, which was a major reef net site. I will add that in addition to these maps themselves, they have the field notes for the surveyors. And so as they went along the shoreline, they noted all these structures, and particularly in Mitchell Bay, they kept on saying Indian hut, Indian fishing hut, Indian hut, all around Mitchell Bay. So this was all occupied by Indigenous peoples at the time of the survey. So it's still being used very much as a basis for fishing in this area. This is a map of the resulting sections from the survey, and it records the actual homestead claims that were made in the area. And again, this will be in two maps, but again, we see Mitchell Bay down here and Westcott Bay here. And so if we go back to some of those names again, we have Pierre Lamy here, Peter Lamy here, and then we have Jones over here. If you recall, one of those family names that was named was Jones. And then up in here we have Verrier, V-A-R-R-E-I-E-R, and that is a connection with the Delaunay family, which was the Cowlitz thing. And again, I'll get back to that later. On the map just south of Mitchell Bay here, we have some really crucial families to the Mitchell Bay Band. These are all Euro-American men who are married Mitchell Bay women. And so we have Samuel Harrison Gross right here. Right next door is his nephew, Charles O. French. Over here is the Briggs's daughter, son-in-law, sorry, Lightheart. And over here we have John Wesley Briggs, who again married a Mitchell Bay. So this is a real cluster of homesteads and families who have married Mitchell Bay women to form this community. So that's why, and it's no wonder that they are from the Mitchell Bay tribe, because they are right here at Mitchell Bay. This is kind of a jungle of names and families and facts that was very hard for me to see the trees for the forest. And let me just give you an example from the 1900 federal census of San Juan Island. So this is, I've given here, everything was bold, is a person in the Mitchell Bay area. And everybody in italics is actually identified as being Indian. So except for, I think one person, James McKay, no, a couple people here who are descendants of these mixed marriages. These are all women, or mainly women, who have married Euro-American men. But you can see, again, these same names cropping up. So Briggs is here, French is here, Gross is here, Oakes, McKay is here, Jones is here, and Rosler. So a lot of these people we've talked about before are indicated on this. But then there's some names who, I just don't have a clue. I haven't quite figured it out. And I'll kind of get into that issue later in regard to names, but I'll just kind of leave you with a sense of trying to sort this out. Okay, we've talked about the women in these families, and so what about the men? And I mentioned that the only real kind of Mitchell Bay or Lummi related man was Shiklemal. All the rest of them are Euro-Americans. And so where'd they come from? How did they get here? And why did they marry Mitchell Bay band or other indigenous peoples here on San Juan Island? So a big source was the Hudson's Bay Company. The Hudson Bay Company was a mixed polyglot. It was the largest corporation, landholding corporation in the world at the time. And it employed French Canadians and Métis. And Métis were mainly mixtures of indigenous peoples in the upper Midwest and mid-Canada and the French settlers. There were Englishmen, Irishmen, and Scots, and there were Kanakas, who I've mentioned before, and I will get into briefly. Then here on the actual occupation of the island, there were Royal Marines on the north end, right near Mitchell Bay at Garrison Bay. There were American soldiers at American Camp on the south side. There were American homesteaders, and by that, I mean both original Americans and also people who became Americans in order to homestead. And then there were immigrants who kind of fell into that other category of homesteaders, but also some of them just remained nationals of their own and settled. So the French Canadians were this big thing, and part of it is the Archambaults, who may have been associated with the Hudson Bay Company at one time. There's a man named Lebeau, very common French Canadian name. And then I mentioned the Delaunay sisters, who are very important to the history of the islands. One of them was Catherine, the oldest one, and she at first married Lazum Verrier. And I mentioned in the Homestead map up near Roach Harbor, there was a Verrier homestead there. This is Lazum Verrier, so he and Catherine homesteaded there. Lazum died, and she remarried Pierre Laplante. They moved to the Deer Harbor area, and then she actually, they homesteaded under Laplante there, and many of her offspring then settled on Orcas Island. The Kanakas are quite a large group, and I will talk about the naming problem of Kanakas later, but these are the names that I've kind of been able to sort out from the group here. And you can see that they are called all sorts of things. You know, they're kind of common English first names, Christian names, if you will, and then there are various transcriptions of Hawaiian names, some of which are more or less accurate, and then there were just kind of names that were just assigned them. But of the ones that we know married Mitchell Bay for sure were John Bull, who married a Klallam Lummi woman mix. Then Akama Kamai, who married I think she was Saanich, Skilmax. A real famous one, Pierre or Peter Friday. I know many of you heard me babble on about this before, but Friday Harbor was not named after Joseph Friday. Joe Friday was named after his father, Peter Friday, and Peter's name was just Friday until he actually married Mary. And at that time in Victoria was given the name Pierre. He didn't have a first name before that. And then Cecile Thomas, who married William Nakano. Now, many of these may have been related, and in fact, there's evidence that some of these were joint weddings or you know, weddings that happened at the same time in Victoria. Okay, so there were Royal Marines stationed at English Camp. That was the main division there, and several of these Marines actually married, again, Mitchell Bay or related women. Jack Ballum, who married Lucy Ontana Jack, and then what happened? Jack died, and Lucy remarried Robert Smith, or maybe the other way around. I can't quite remember. And then there's Adelaide Delaunay. Okay, so this is Catherine's sister, or half sister, I should say, and she first married Smith Burr. If you recall, in the township and survey range map near Mitchell Bay, there was a Smith Burr on the coast, on the seashore right near Garrison Bay. And then after Smith Burr died, she married Peter W. Smith, who was also English. There are a whole bunch of Americans coming into the islands, and part of them came in through the Army. At the time, the US Army was about 40% Irish and about 20% German origin. And so it's not surprising that there were Irish and German American soldiers here. Patrick Began, I mentioned before, married Lucy Morse, who was near the Haida Gwaii. And then another Irishman, Arthur Barlow, married Lucinda, or Lucy Kanansky, and they ended up with Sam Barlow on Lopez Island and that whole family. Of the Germans, Christopher Rosler was a soldier at American camp. When he mustered out, he married Anna Pike, who was a Tsimshian. And then I mentioned before Matthias Paul Rathwison, who married Nellie George, who was Nahomish, who was way over on the mainland. C.B.R. Kennerly is a really fascinating man, a scientist, botanist, etc. He was part of the U.S. Boundary Survey, and he first married Jane, and I'm not going to pronounce that name, who was actually Semiahmoo. So the first camp of the U.S. Boundary Survey was at Boundary Bay, which was right near the Semiahmoo. And so this was Jane's first marriage, and she would go on to marry 3 other husbands. So. And then there are a bunch of just plain Americans, and they came to the islands in various ways. John Wesley Briggs, his nephew was Charles O. French. Sorry, John Wesley Briggs. Charles O. French was the nephew of Samuel H. Gross, so of the person next to him, Charles McKay and Daniel Oakes, and all of whom married important women that way. And a whole bunch of immigrants. So these were French that, as far as I could tell, were not French Canadians associated with Hudson Bay Company, but Louis Caillou is definitely a name we all recognize. Marianne Solomon was actually his second marriage. His first marriage was probably Mitchell Bay band woman. We're just not too sure about that. She apparently died in a Northern Indian raid, along with his other children. And Edward Green, who married one of the Thomas sisters from the Swinomish Reservation, he and Louis Laporte, who came down here, who married the other sister. Peter Lamy, we saw several times at Mitchell Bay. He was a fisherman and a boatman there. John Laporte, who married a Thomas, and then Julian Lawrence, again, who married a Cowichan woman. And I'm not too sure about Ellen Isaac Papillon, but Isaac Papillon, I believe, was the nephew of one of these other families. We have a German, Anton Seppes, who married an Emma and settled on Waldron Island. Christ Olsen, who was a Dane, and he married one of the T-Whalum sisters. And then John Curtola, who was, again, married let's see, Louis Laporte's wife after Louis died. So. No, sorry, John Laporte. Okay. Getting this all confused. Too many families in the air here. Okay, I'm gonna kind of go briefly through a case study of one of my favorite people, just to show you some of the complexities of one of these families, but also how it's interrelated through the islands. So Catherine Bull was born in 1853, probably on San Juan Island, to John Bull. And John Bull was also named Stefano. Where did that come from? And he was born in the then Sandwich Islands. So when you look on the census, it will say SI, Sandwich Islands. He was a Kanaka. He signed on to the Hudson Bay Company in 1838. So he was pretty young, 15 years old. He worked at Fort Nisqually, which was on the mainland, and then became a shepherd at Bellevue Sheep Farm here on San Juan Island. And he died around 1860. The Hudson Bay Company had a system of where their what they called servants, their employees, could actually get land. And so he actually did a homestead under that system in San Juan Valley, which is now where Zylstra Lake is. So, so he started that process. Catherine was the one who finished it up. John married Fuhuehua Mary Squallop, and she has other names, but she was basically classified as a Mitchell Bay Band member, but her father was Lummi and her mother was Clallam. So when you think about this geographically, Clallam is on the Olympic Peninsula to the south of us. Lummi is on the mainland to the northeast of us, and they met on San Juan Island. And both groups were using the island. So this is not a surprise here that she was of both that ancestry. So, as I said, her mother had other names: Maria Hohema Hueat, Hoasuikiat, Jefferson, and I will get into names later on, but her father was George Jefferson and her mother was, and I'm not going to try to pronounce it. So she had at least 4 children then: Charles, Jean Auguste, Joseph or Joe Bull, and Sophia or Sophie Bull, in addition to Catherine. And then after Catherine's father, John, died, she married another Kanaka, John Kahana, and he had a whole bunch of different names. And they in turn had a whole bunch of kids too, including Charles Kahana, who became a really famous fiddler. And so there's a lot of family information from him. And quite a few of these people, as with many of the Kanakas, eventually went to Salt Spring Island or one of the Canadian Gulf Islands and settled there. So there's a large Kanaka family connections up there. And here's a picture of Mary there and John Kahana, her second husband, and this is Robert Bull, so one of their children. And I mentioned Catherine's siblings. So one of them is Joe Bull here, and he's featured in this group portrait. And what's really interesting is that these are all Orcasians. These are all Orcas Islanders. Joe Bull actually had a homestead in Crow Valley. Right near him was Sammy Freshett, who married into these families. Right here on the lower right is Peter Laplante Jr. If you recall, Pierre or Peter Laplante married Catherine Delaunay, and so they're one of the French Canadian and Cowlitz connections that way, and Peter's their son. And Peter married an Iot, who's another French Canadian family on Orcas. And then I can't remember this guy, but he kind of figures in also. So it's really a very interconnected family that way. And And part of this is through sisters. So for the Clallam group, we have the T-Whalams, so Mary, Cecilia, and Marianne. For the Cowlitz, I just mentioned that Delaney family, really huge and important, Catherine, Mary Agnes, and Adelaide. And for the Songies or Songish, we have Marianne and Mary Skomiaks, who are actually a part of a chief tribe, apparently. And then for the Swinomish, which are, again, down near kind of Anacortes and that area, are Louisa and Lena Thomas, both of whom ended up on Waldron. And it gets further complicated by all their intermarriages. So to give you just 4 cases, Catherine Laplante. So she's the daughter of Catherine Delaney. She's also the sister of Peter Laplante Jr. So she marries Peter Laplante. Sorry, she marries Peter Freshet, who is in that photograph. And her brother Peter marries Idelle Yoet, who's a French-Canadian family. So James Adam McKay, who's the son of Charles McKay, and Mary Josephine Innes, who I think we think is Mitchell Bay Band. Mary Lucretia Archambault, who's the daughter of a Delaney and an Archambault. So major connection that way. In terms of the Burr family, now if you remember, Adelaide Delaney married twice. She first married Smith Burr, who had that place near Westcott Bay, and their son Joseph married Mary Alice Woodworth. And then their son, John Burr, married Mary Alice's sister, Margaret, who had formerly been married to Lincoln McKay, who was a Mitchell Bay Band family that way. And finally, Adelaide Delaney's daughter with Peter Smith. Okay, so this is her second marriage after Smith Burr dies. And that is Agnes Smith marries Ben Briggs. And then her son, Peter Henry Smith, marries Harriet or Hattie Matilda Briggs. So it's, oh boy, it gets really complicated. And I wish there was some sort of graphic system that I could do that. So I'm going to end by talking about some of these challenges that have kind of devolved from this research, and hopefully it'll. And I want to say at the beginning that this project has raised more questions than it has answered. I know I've uncovered a lot of information, and but there's just, there's a lot more to do, and I think it's really important. So first of all, names of indigenous peoples. I think pre-contact, it was customary among local Strait Salish tribes to actually not really name children until they reached puberty. So they became adults and they were given an actual name. That gets really complicated when Euro-Americans enter the project, first of all, as Christians, because they try to convert some of the indigenous peoples and give them Christian names. So we find a lot of things, people being named Mary or Jenny or Jane or, Charles or things like that, or even presidential names, Thomas Jefferson's, George Washington's, those become very common. And then they have, in addition to their own given names, they have kind of what are vaguely family names. And so it just becomes very difficult to trace the families through their names. I mean, I think in many ways, we have it relatively easy in terms, and this is not a judgment, but in terms of Euro-American basically husbands' names, because if you look up a Pratt, you can usually follow that, and usually with the wives' names, you can follow the maiden names and follow them back. And I know that gets really complicated, and I'm not about to step into that morass, but it's really a lot easier, I find, than doing research this way. The Kanakas are a whole bunch of issues. You've noticed back in the slide about some of the Kanakas and the various names they were called, and I'll just point out a real simple thing, and that is that in the English language we have 26 letters. In the Hawaiian language there are 12. And the reason there are 12 was that they were assigned by missionaries in order to actually put the Hawaiian language into print. And I thought you might enjoy this thing from a meeting in 1826, which was held by a bunch of my ancestors in Hawaii, who were part of the missionaries who were out there. And this was Hiram Bingham and Levi Chamberlain, who did in 1826 a report of the Committee of Health on the state of the Hawaiian alphabet. And this is actually, these guys are often thought of as being strict Calvinists, had little or no sense of humor, but I think you may find it different. It says B and D are expelled by a lukewarm emetic of a pretty unanimous vote. K is deemed of sufficient capacity to perform its own functions and that of its counterpart T. L, though 2 pills have been given to expel it, is to remain to do its own office and that of its yoke fellow R. R, though closely connected with the vitals, is expelled by 5 or 6 votes, or expellents, though nearly the same quantity of preservatives have been applied. T, though claiming rights as a native member, has suffered amputation by the knife and saw of the majority. V, a contiguous member and claiming similar rights, has suffered the same fate, and a gentle something has been applied to dry the wounds of Bath. The remaining members, A, E, I, O, U, K, L, M, N, P, and W, are all likely to live and do well so long as the present College of Physicians have the sole direction of its life and health. So sorry, I had to get back to the Hawaiian connection, but that is why Jim in Hawaiian is chemo. That is why George in Hawaiian is Kioki. That is why Samuel in Hawaiian is Kamuela. So you have this whole issue of transcribing into the English language, and then you have people's handwriting, and they're actually hearing what the Kanaka is saying as their name and writing it down, and you have a whole bunch of problems. So what I'm saying is that the name issue is not confined to Indigenous peoples. It's definitely in terms of research, and in terms of the Kanakas, and it's something that has to be done. During this project, it started it started actually a little before the pandemic. No, it started in the pandemic and has continued through that. So this is all online, folks. I have not been able to visit any archives or museums, only virtually, and that has been some help, but I think that's a real drawback to actually going to places and seeing those documents for themselves. And the final thing is, I just want to talk about the international border, which is just a false construction in a lot of ways. I know we have it. I know we can't, we can't not recognize it. But first of all, in the pandemic, I couldn't go to Victoria or other places to do research. And that's pretty vital. And I want to say that the growing presence of the border through history has been a real, I think the Indigenous peoples of our region have suffered greatly from Euro-American occupation and basically stealth of their lands. But I think that the imposition of the border has really specifically impacted the members of the Mitchell Bay Band and their folks. So this idea that somehow a tribe is confined to a reservation and that land is just false. And I think in particular, in terms of the Mitchell Bay Band, we need to reach across the border to those groups who are clearly members of this band and reunite them. So, you know, and that sounds very presumptuous. I don't mean we. I think if anybody who wants to truly get an understanding of this group and furthermore to honor this group, need to connect that. So with that note of caution, I'm going to get out of my thing and welcome any questions or comments. I've stunned you all.
No, I have a comment, and it struck me way at the beginning of your talk when you were talking about how many people were trying to be recognized. Now, was it the Quileute tribe? What did you say?
Yeah, that's right. Quinault and Quileute. Yeah.
Okay. And how one of the things that was popular for a while during this, doing genealogy for people, was how anxious people were to trace their ancestors back to some sort of native tribe because they were anxious to get financial reward out of that. So I found your part on that pretty interesting, that sense of receiving financial compensation or land or something was kind of a motivator for people to be designated.
Yeah, and I agree, Kathy, and I think it's really one of the to our benefit, of course, because they obviously wouldn't have done this if there hadn't been that incentive. I don't see why they would. And I think it is a big issue. I mean, the whole Elizabeth Warren, and I won't go into the politics of that, but the whole issue of recognition of Native American blood and what that means is a continuing issue and I think a continuing tribal issue in this area too. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and in so many of the censuses, I remember working with one woman and something came up in a census just like that, that her ancestor did have Native American recognition and all that. And then there's this whole other theme that many people would not even identify themselves as Native American at a certain point in time. So it's interesting, the mixture.
Yeah, and I will point to, I think both Robin and Lind have encountered this in their research where they're tracking one of these people who are associated with a Native family, and all of a sudden, because of the climate, they don't want to be recognized as that, and they become somebody else. And I totally get that. I mean, I don't begrudge them that. I think it's a fact of history in a certain sense.
Yeah.
So
it's interesting.
So I have a question or two. First of all, Boyd, you were so wonderful with your lead-in for where these tribes originated. I've been interested in the Native American influence here ever since I was around 7 years old, with connection with the artist anyway, when I was here on the island in the summers. And yet, I never was able, until your talk, to really realize what a melting pot our island is. And I just loved the clarity of pointing that out. Thank you so much. And that leads to, well, and the intermarriages, especially because when someone died, either the wife or the husband, it was a foregone conclusion. You were going to get married again, because if you wanted any more children, or if you wanted the wife to be working in the gardens and the husband to be providing the fish, or whatever it is, you had to have this family entity. You didn't live very well by yourself. Some people did, maybe out of personality or something else. But anyway, so that was the norm in those days. So like you say, it gets very complicated, not even because of foreigners, quote unquote, that were not part of the tribal groups. And then when the whites came in and so forth, the whole customs of that time. So that brings up the question, how about communication with languages? Because didn't each one of these, just going back to the tribal groups, each one had their own language, and I don't know if they could always understand each other. And then you get the English and the French and the Irish and all that. And then the other question is, what about the, let's call it property rules? And you know, they didn't necessarily, quote unquote, own property here on the island, but they had control over their fishing area and this and that and the other place, and where to live. And the other question is, were these groups all year round here on the islands or not, or seasonal? But how about those rules of asking permission to come to your area and either visit or whatever? So the two questions, language and property rights.
Yeah, well, those are great questions, and I'll start with the language one first of all, with in terms of indigenous languages, and that is that the as Wayne Suttles pointed out, that the kind of tongue that defined the Straight Salish was pretty universal in the islands, except for and it was as if it were like America, where you had English but different accents, you know. So down East Maine really differs from the South, right, to the point of almost being unrecognizable to some people. And so there was the Straight Salish, so the Songhees and the Saanich and the Lummi and the Semiahmoo and so forth really kind of were able to bridge that gap. But I think there was also, and I'm totally forgetting the name of it, but there was a trade language, basically. Who can help me with this? That was a polyglot slang. And it was made up of various English and American and
Chinook.
Chinook, thank you very much. And so I gather that.
However,
that was used.
Chinook had very few words, very few letters, and it became very confusing for the tribes.
Yeah. So I think that I want to say that I can't remember. There's a phrase in New Mexico when they were talking about a lot of the Anglo-Americans marrying a lot of the Hispanics in New Mexico, and they talked about the brides being pillow dictionaries. I know that's a very derogatory term, but I think that in these intermarriages were very much linguistic too. And so there was a lot of learning and cultural interchange that way. And that kind of gets to your second question, Margot, and that is that I will say that the Strait Salish were tradespeople. They lived by trading, and marriages were part of that trading. I mean, they forged strong alliances between families among the Strait Salish, among the various groups of the Strait Salish. So having Clallam and Lummi mix was great in terms of connections. And that was part of the economic deal, you know. I'm not too sure love figured into it at the beginning, at least, and of the marriage. And so the idea of resources and resources you had was important. So as I said, I think the islands were probably host to winter villages early on, but raids from the northern tribes, and they always blamed it on the Haida. Well, I don't think it was the Haida. I think it was further north. Kind of really endangered the islands. They were very, very exposed. And so they withdrew to mainland villages for winter villages and only came here during the summer. Now, when they came here in the summer, they had at least two resources that were probably what they called usufruct possessed, and that is, and through matrilineal lines, and that was camas beds, which were definitely properties of various families and maintained by various families. And then reef net sites were super important, and they went through family lines also. And
what
so
was the thing you said?
camas and reef nets, reef netting.
Reef nets. Yes, yes, yes.
And so I think that when they're coming to gather camas and other plants, and when they're coming to reef net, they're coming to their place, and that still holds in certain areas. I mean, it's not so much of the camas, but the reef nets. So I think those are two property related things that it's not our Euro-American sense of property, but it definitely is a strong connection.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So Boyd, I'm really interested in your statement about the Haidas because I've been mad at them for a long time for coming to Orcas and murdering so many people. And
Yeah.
So now do I need to rethink this?
I would, and I recommend a paper by Mike Vorey called, what's it called, Vikings of the North or Raiders from the North or something like that. I can give you the reference to that, but I think they've located it in other northern groups, and it's kind of like Haida canoes. You know, everybody says, well, the Haidas built all the canoes and those were the huge war canoes and stuff like that. Well, apparently the Haida did build a lot of them, but they actually sold them. I mean, they traded them to other groups. And so if you appeared in a Haida canoe, it wasn't necessarily Haida. So yeah, it's not like they didn't have a hand in it, but I don't think it's all them to blame. So.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
Yes. That would be great to send a link.
Yeah, I'll give you the reference. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay. Well, I think it's about time to close. So our library person, Mary, can have a lunch break. So unless anybody has another burning question or something. Okay.
Well, thank you. It was very, very good. Really glad I was able to come.
Yes.
Thank you.
I recognized a lot of names, which was really fun for me.
Yeah. Yeah, there are a lot of Orcas people involved.
Yeah, well, the Chevaliers were a big family friend of ours as well from San Juan. And so anyway, that was pretty interesting. The Laplante, though, is an interesting one. I need to find out about that because I remember Bonnie Laplante, but I never associated them. And I'm curious about that family. You know, I know about the Laportes, but I didn't know about the Laplantes. So,
Yeah, right.
yeah. So, are you familiar with a book called Eagle Song?
No.
I read it a long, long time ago, and I believe that it is nonfiction, but it's a fabulous book. I can give the I can send you the author. I don't remember the author, but it is all about the tribes and them not doing great things to each other, but also it was in the 1860s, in that era. I just remember it being a fascinating book. And I think it was based on the truth.
That's great.
I'll look it up.
What was the name, Lise? What was the name of that one?
Eagle Song.
Because I was about to suggest, if people hadn't read it, that the historical fiction, again, a lot of it's based on history, called Mischmas, Mistchimas, 3 different kind of sections. And this woman, J.L. Oakley, lives on Lopez, I believe. I forget what her first name is. Anyway, she calls it a novel of captivity. And it is also based starting in the late 1800s and includes Hudson Bay Company and so forth. So it's also a wonderful reference to exactly what you were talking about, Boyd. Have you read that book?
Yeah, and it's Janet Oakley, and she actually gave a talk at the San Juan Library about it. So yeah. Yeah.
So what did you think about her rendition?
Well, she did a lot of research for it, and you know, she's a good friend of Mike Vorey, so she knows the whole Hudson Bay American Camp connection really well. And I thought it was really good that way. The only drawback I thought was the cover, quite frankly, which looks like a bodice ripper, and it's
it's
a lot
of fun. It's a lot of fun because it, like you say, she's got a lot of real history in there, and yet makes it a real kind of serial thing. So thanks.
Right.
Real quickly, I wanted to thank Boyd.
Yes, thank you, Boyd.
Yeah, this was, even though I've worked with these Native families and the cross-cultural marriages for a number of years, I was speechless at the end of the presentation. It was just so beautifully put together, and because I'm so familiar with so many of the names and the relationships, because I researched for the San Juan Historical Museum, it was still fascinating to me to visit them, to visit these people in a different way of looking at them. So I just really enjoyed that. Thank you, Boyd.
Thank you.
The university in our homeland, right on our doorstep.